afternoon, everybody. This is Truth Seeker here. And summer's done for good. It ended abruptly. We had a 90-degree day 2 days ago, and now we have to adjust to these 50s and 60-degree temperatures. So summer's gone. This past week I read a book. It doesn't often happen where I am so captivated by a book that I can't put it down, but it happened with this book, and a good friend of mine gave it to me thinking that I might enjoy it because I do live nearby this area, and it's of great significance here in the United States. It's actually one of the greatest travesties, and it made me think of a bit of the irony or hypocrisy or both that is involved in this set of circumstances as it plays out with Watchtower. Because while I've always known about this situation since it became public, it's not something that I really put together in terms of my activism, anybody else's activism for a matter of fact. It's not something that many individuals would know other than more of the local population. And the book that I've read, I finished it. I just couldn't put it down. It was one of those books where if you could grab a second to read, I'd pick it up and I read it. There are not many books that captivate me that way. But this one did. And it turns out to be this young man's first novel. I was surprised to hear that he's only 29 years old. Yet he writes with the wisdom and depth of experience of someone who's lived a full life. And he's only 29 years old. The book, and I'm going to give it a plug, it's called Mixed Bloods. And that title was chosen for a number of reasons, subtle reasons. And if you notice the pretty rainbow colors on there, the implication of mixed blood, you think of more in terms of a racial circumstances, ethnic, racial aspects come more to the fore in your mind, but it turns out that this is an environmental, ecological disaster of unprecedented proportions, and this has to do with big industry, has to do with poverty, has to do with an Aboriginal people who occupied this territory long before the European settlers, and the disdain, the prejudice, and the ignominy in which these people have had to live under with their encroaching white neighbors, and how they've had to survive this ignominy. I grew up in this area. I was born and raised in Rockland County. I went to school in the Nanuet public school systems. I was familiar with these Ramapo Mountain Indians. Long time ago, my father used to employ them. Back then, my father would call them Jackson Whites. Now that's a pejorative. It's as derogatory and spiteful a name as the N-word is to the black population, black African American in our country. And these people can trace their history back into these mountains, this region that I live in, and this is part of the region that you see in the background there. Sorry, I'm not holding it straight, but these little rolling hills on the eastern seaboard, just north and west of New York City, only 35-40 miles from New York City, are called the Ramapo Hills. And the Ramapo Mountains, actually, the Appalachian Trail is only about 3 miles. It runs along the ridge that I just showed you, at the top of that ridge. This is a part of the Appalachian chain. It is unique in that this is the last natural refuge in the most populated area of the United States, the most densely populated area in the world, which is northern New Jersey. Even more densely populated than India, believe it or not. In parts of northern New Jersey, around Union, North Bergen, closer into the city, constitute some of the most densely populated areas in the world. And yet these people, living so close to New York City, have maintained a cultural and a separate heritage and identity, and maintained this identity for as long as records go back in U.S. history. They are recognized as Native Americans by the state of New Jersey, and I do believe the state of New York recently recognized them also. However, with politics and being so close to New York and Donald Trump in the mix, these individuals never really got a fair hearing for identity as a recognized Native American tribe by the Department of Interior, despite years of legal wrangling. One of the problems that these people face is the fact that they've been stripped of their dignity and of their identity in many ways by the people that have settled and taken the land around them, and then on top of that poisoned that land. Now, you may wonder, what does this have to do with Watchtower? Well, I'll get to that in a little bit. I just would like to talk a little about the history of this area to some extent. And this area of northern New Jersey, southeastern New York, the Ramapo Hills, is full of iron. This area was the first iron mining in the United States. There are iron mines dotted throughout these hills all over the place. For when we were a colony, they discovered this. When we were a British colony, they discovered iron, very high quality iron ore, magnetite. 80% iron. You can take a magnet and hold it to the rock and it's magnetized. The compass won't do you any good up here because it just goes spinning in circles. The ground is so full of iron. And it's also solid rock. It's ancient rock. metamorphic rock, gneiss, G-N-E-I-S-S, gneiss. And it's a granitic, granitic type of rock, a crystalline rock, very hard, very dense, because it was sedimentary rock that was formed by great heat and pressures and transformed into gneiss. So in every respect, it seems very much like granite. Geologist could tell you a little more about it than I could. But this area was full of mines. And the locals, for hundreds of years, were used to, their labor was exploited to do the mining. And so that provided the livelihood for many of the individuals around here. This area wasn't good for agriculture, very thin topsoils, rocky ground, mountains, and so Europeans didn't find much in the way of value of the land up here outside of the mining. So the Ramapo natives the land really was, they were able to maintain their hold on a good portion of the land, although white people, European descent, bought up much of the land in a legal sense. You know, it's funny, I don't know how much truth there is, but anybody with some long heritage in the United States, the family goes back to the colonial days and pre-colonial, the pre-U.S. Era. Like my family has stories about Native American heritage, and that's the same with my mom's side of the family. We had stories about Native American heritage. In particular, the mini sink, which were a part of actually the greater tribe of the Lenape, which were an Algonquin-speaking group of peoples that lived in New Jersey from southeastern New York all the way to Delaware. The Brits called them the Delaware Indians because of their proximity to the Delaware River. Well, I did some research as a result of that because I was interested in the Lenape because of that chance that I might have some heritage. I did do a genetic test, and it doesn't reveal anything, but again, they from what I understand of these genetic tests, that you have to do special tests to find if you go back 5 or 6 generations, you may not have any genes or genetics that may be detectable this far down in the genealogy. So can't rule it out, but the likelihood is that I really don't. Nonetheless, I became interested in researching the Lenape, and again, like all Native Americans, they were screwed by the Europeans. And you see, the Native Americans had an entirely different concept of land and ownership. They had a communal lifestyle where everybody contributed to the community. If you shot a deer, it wasn't your deer, it was the community's deer. Now, you may have had maybe the first dibs having caught it, but you shared it. And that was the case with all of the Lenape, and probably the greater part of the eastern Native American cultures up and down the eastern seaboard of America before what they call pre-Columbian days, before Europeans began to colonize the eastern seaboard. And unfortunately, they didn't think of land as anything differently than air. I mean, we don't say this is my air, and you have to, in order to breathe this air, you have to pay me for it. And that was the way they thought of land. And so the Europeans, they took the land from the Lenape, and they got pushed west and further west and further west, and eventually they settled on a piece of land that the Cherokees, who were pushed to Oklahoma through the Trail of Tears, we have a horrible legacy. They allowed the Lenape to settle, and the Lenape got recognition as a separate individual nation on the Cherokee Reservation, I think back in 1996. I could be wrong. But in 1906 there was a roll, and anybody on that roll is considered Lenape. But that didn't include anybody that was left here in the east. And the Ramapoughs were part of the Lenape tribe. And a little about what I've researched and read is that they likely were in the area of Connecticut originally, before the Dutch. This Hudson Valley was first colonized by the Dutch before the English. And stories, New York City was New Amsterdam, and the Hudson Valley, the stories of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman, and other legendary sources, stories like Rip Van Winkle. That all dates back to the Dutch colonial times, when this New Netherlands colony up and down the Hudson River from New York City, Long Island actually, to Albany was settled. And the Dutch weren't particularly friendly with the Native Americans here. When it's important to note that when the Native Americans, when the Dutch and the Europeans, the English, began to colonize the eastern seaboard of America, the numbers of Native Americans had been depleted badly by disease before the colonies even began. The reason for that is that there was some interaction with Europeans who were fishing the Grand Banks in the 1500s. There were explorers like John Cabot and others that made contact with the Native Americans on the east coast of North America during the late 1500s. The Grand Banks were just a wealth of fish for Europeans. So before they actually colonized North America, they'd sail their boats all the way to the Grand Banks and fish, and they brought disease with them, and in particular smallpox, and 90% of the Native Americans died from smallpox before the Plymouth colony even started. Why there's so many fields like Springfield and Meadowfield and all these towns with the word field in them. If you look in an atlas, you'll notice that New England and the Northeast is replete with towns that end with field. Well, that's because the Algonquin Indians were semi-nomadic, but they lived in communities also. They were partly communal, and they lived in long houses. They had their form of agriculture. They grew corn, maize, they grew squash, and other vegetables, and so they had an agricultural society, as well as foraging, hunter gathering and the such. So the combination was of hunting and growing food agriculturally was how they sustained themselves, and it was a communal effort everybody put into the community. And when all of these Native Americans died, as a result of this epidemic that just wiped out their numbers, all of the fields were there for the natives had cleared these fields that the colonists could use to grow their own food that they brought with them from Europe. And so the Native Americans were in no shape to really put up any kind of a serious resistance against the Europeans as they came. And the Ramapoughs, there have been dugout canoes that have been found in lakes in Connecticut that can be attributed and associated with the Ramapoughs. They're in the town of Butler, just a couple of miles away from here. There were 2 dugout canoes found in the bottom of a lake, preserved at the bottom of a lake in 1923, attributed to the Ramapoughs. And so what anthropologists believe is that the Ramapoughs had been, there was a conflict with the Dutch. They'd been pushed out of Connecticut and they moved into the hills that couldn't be farmed by the Dutch colonists, and so they moved and they stayed in the Ramapo Hills here. And then when the iron was discovered, they made their livelihood as laborers, day laborers in the iron mines. A very, very tough living. And throughout that period, they were known by many different names, mostly derogatory, pejoratives. They were never accepted by the white society. They were always held in low esteem, and so they lived an impoverished life, isolated in these hills for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, these mines ran out of value. They began shutting them down around the turn of the 20th century, and by the middle of the 20th century, the last of the iron mines was shut down. There's a mine, the Sterling mine, that's very close to the Watchtower headquarters that can be visited. That shut down in 1923, and Sterling Forest State Park has a visitor center there where you can learn a little about the iron mining that took place. Well, here you had this community of people who society rejected. Many of them took on names of the colonials, especially during the Dutch era, to help soften their interaction with white society. So many of these people have surnames such as De Groot, De Vries, Mann, Van Dunk. They don't sound like Indian names. They took these names in order to be able to interact with white society and to avoid slavery, because the earliest slaves were not the ones brought here, but who lived here, and that Native Americans were among the very first slaves in the northern colonies. Believe it or not, slavery was not abolished in New Jersey until 1865, the end of the Civil War. They did not make slavery illegal in this state at the beginning of the Civil War. That, as you might think, it was the North versus the South. There were slaves in the North, and there was slavery in New Jersey until 1865, when the 14th Amendment outlawing the, I think, or was it the 13th Amendment? 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery. But that was substantially later than anybody would probably guess. So these people lived a life up here in the woods, eking out a sustenance, and Ford found a plot of land, several hundred acres, bigger than that, I guess. It was a large piece of land, and they decided to build a plant. This turned out to be the largest automobile manufacturing plant in the United States. Actually, the son of Henry Ford, I think it was Edsel Ford, or maybe Henry Ford the second, or somebody like that. It was a Ford heir who opened up the plant in 1955, the year I was born. And they began operations in 1955. The largest automobile manufacturing plant in the United States. Well, as a part of assembly line manufacturing, they had to paint the cars. And here they were. The Mahwah Ford plant was right at the edge of the Ramapo Mountains. The Ramapo Mountains having derived their name from the Native Americans who occupied that land. And so Ford took it upon themselves to buy up much of the wilderness up here with that, as you can see from the aerial video footage, that this land up here is very rural. We're only 40 miles out of New York, and yet we have black bears and bobcats and otters and you name it living here. It's a very critical ecosystem, very unique ecosystem, so close to New York. And this land, being close to New York, was highly valuable. There was an effort back in the 1980s to develop over 20,000 acres of sterling forest and put in 30,000 housing units and 3 golf courses. And due to a grassroots effort, that those development plans were thwarted. And interestingly enough, Watchtower was one of the few private entities that was able to snatch up what available land didn't get incorporated into the park. It's a shame that International Nickel didn't donate that land to the park, because it leaves a hole in the park that now has Watchtower on it. But that's not the bad part. I mean, it's bad enough that they cleared out 100 acres of woods and displaced creatures that are on the endangered and threatened list. But they hired themselves a lawyer and was able to get themselves an ecological impact statement, and somehow swung I think through deceit, an approval by the town of Warwick. Warwick, thinking that the 1,500 additional Jehovah's Witnesses were going to spend money in town, and little do they know that these 1,500 additional Jehovah's Witnesses don't spend money because they don't have money. But that's another story altogether. Unfortunately, the headquarters is more in New Jersey than it is in Warwick. Like I've said in previous videos, they're about 20 miles out of the actual town center, village center of Warwick. Really, they are closer to Sloatsburg, Hilburn, Suffern than they are to the actual village of Warwick. But this Ford plant operated for parts of 3 decades. They closed down in the 1970s, and during the manufacturing, the height of their manufacturing days, during the 1960s and 70s, part of the assembly line included spray painting, and spray painting generated tens of thousands. If you ever saw, watch the video. It's an HBO video called Man versus Ford. Man versus Ford. It's a 2-hour documentary. Man v. Ford. V stands for versus. Man v. Ford. M-A-N-N is the name Man. That's one of the surnames of the Ramapo Indians, one of the common surnames that are found up there. And Ford had bought a bunch of what they thought was basically wilderness and wasteland, and they contracted with waste haulers to get rid of this paint sludge, and they were generating about 10,000 gallons of this sludge a day. We call it a sludge, but it was liquefied with chlorinated solvents, like such as methylene chloride, very common solvent, perchloroethylene, things that are also at that time were commonly used for dry cleaning agents. But back then they didn't understand the carcinogenic effects that these solvents had. And Ford took this sludge and dumped it on the land wherever they could, in the woods, in the middle of the neighborhoods of the Ramapo Lenape. And they actually built homes on mountains of this sludge, with the foundations built into it as if it was soil. And the people there living there, they didn't know that this was toxic. They didn't know that what they were dumping into the mines, millions, untold millions of gallons of paints and paint sludges and other wastes and toxic wastes were dumped into these mines, all of these mines, Peter's mine in particular, and Cannon mine and other mines that dotted the area. And the area, in fact, actually a lot of the sludge solidified over time. It looks like a rock. But if you cut it open, it's a rainbow of color from the sludge. I'm going to just stop us here a second, and I wanted to show you the proximity of Peter's mine to Watchtower. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a file. And I had made a couple of photos here that I'm going to we go. Now, this photo that I just added, okay, shows two things. One is the cover of a JW document that I got off of JW.org. It's called Jehovah's Witnesses and the Community. And the reason I did this is because I never really thought about it and put the two together. But here, the Watchtower brags, just blatantly brags about all of the humanitarian work they've done. They have tax-exempt status as a humanitarian organization. They claim to fly all over the world to respond to natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, and all manner of floods and all manner of afflictions that displace people and ruin individuals' lives. And everybody knows who's an ex-Jehovah's Witness knows that really Jehovah's Witnesses in the Watchtower only help Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't help the community around them. But that's not what this document says. This document says that Jehovah's Witnesses are great neighbors. They get involved in the community and that they help the community. Well, here, this map on the left side of this cover of Jehovah's Witnesses and the Community, I have shown at the bottom of that little lake that you see there is the Watchtower headquarters, and the red line to the yellow pin that I have added to that Google Earth image is the direct line distance to Peter's Mine, the worst of the contamination that was put there by Ford. This is where hundreds of people are coming down who live in that area. You can see along the road, that's Peter's Mine Road. It's identified in Google Earth. And you see all these little homes along that road. And there are hundreds of individuals of the Ramapough Nation that are all dying of cancer. I mean, absolutely horrific cancers. And if Watchtower had any sense of community, they've got it right there on their doorstep, the chance and the opportunity to help a people in need. And do they? At best, if they go back in that community, all they do is hand out Watchtowers or Awake magazines. That's all they do. They do nothing for that community. And 2 to 1, if you ask the governing body who the Ramapoughs are, they would have absolutely no idea who the Ramapough people are. And the Ramapough people are those individuals that have occupied this land, this territory, for hundreds of years. This individual here is one of their community leaders. She is one of those that have become terribly ill. These individuals are coming down with every form of cancer that you can possibly think. They're totally impoverished. They have no money to stand up against a multi-billion-dollar organization to make a legal fight and a legal case to clean up the land. This is the only Superfund site in U.S. history that was closed by EPA and reopened again by EPA, forced to reopen because they didn't come anywhere near cleaning up the land and cleaning up the contaminated groundwater that belongs to these people. Now, Ford has done some compensation for the pollution, but how do you compensate for death? And how good a neighbor is Watchtower? Really, when you come right down to it, as a humanitarian organization that boasts how great they are, well, here you go, Watchtower. This is a perfect opportunity to show that you could help a people, no strings attached, with no expectations that you get anything in return, to help a people recover from what we interlopers from Europe had done to these people. Yeah, well, okay, I may sound a little radical, but after reading this book, Mixed Bloods, and after having done a little research into this matter, I feel that we, as a society, owe these people some compensation. There's no way that we can compensate them for what they've suffered over the years, but we at least should, at the minimum, clean up their land and help them get through their lives, because we've poisoned them. We've killed these people. This is really what it amounts to, is a genocide that we don't know how many thousands of individuals succumbed to that toxic poison that was just dumped on their land. So this is a challenge to Watchtower. Why won't you really do what you say you do? Why don't you become a good neighbor?